Section 39 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Flowers of Freethought by George William Foote. Section 39. Desecrating a Church. There was a pantheon at Rome, which was a monument of the religious tolerance of the empire. It was dedicated, as appears from the inscription on the portico, by Agrippa, son-in-law to the great Augustus, to Jupiter and all the other gods, with the same generosity that prompted the Athenians to erect an altar to the gods that might be unknown. A niche was afforded within its walls to every deity of the provinces whose devotees were willing to accept the hospitality, and Christ himself might have figured with the rest, if his worshippers did not scorn all other gods but their own. The old pantheon still exists, and bears the name of the Rotunda, but it is no longer a pagan temple. It was rededicated by Pope Boniface IV in AD 608 to the Virgin Mary and all the saints. Another pope, 1,000 years later, despoiled it of its ornaments, which had been spared by so many barbarian conquerors. He cast some into canon, and with the rest he formed a high altar for the Church of St. Peter. These alterations were, of course, justifiable. They were all made in the interest of Christianity. What could be more proper than the transformation of pagan temples into Christian churches? What more admirable than devoting to the worship of Christ the edifice which had echoed to the tread of the priests of Jupiter? What more pious than singing the praises of Mary and all the saints in a temple where idolaters had celebrated the glories of all the gods and goddesses of Olympus? Such is Christian logic. But if the temples of one faith may be so transformed, why may not those of another? If Christianity had the right to devote the temples of paganism to its own uses, why has not modern civilization the right to devote the temples of Christianity to secular purposes? The Church thinks otherwise. It is at present denouncing the secularization of the Church of Saint Genevieve, in order that Victor Hugo, who died a freethinker and was buried without religious rites, might repose in an unconsecrated place. This building is the French Pantheon. It was secularized during the Revolution and dedicated by the Republic, not to the gods of religion, but to the heroes of liberty. When the monarchy was restored, it was reconsecrated and purged of the luciferous taint of Voltaire's dust. But now the Republic is once more established on the ruins of monarchy and imperialism, it again secularizes the Church of Saint Genevieve as a tomb for its mighty dead. The Church is naturally indignant, but its anathemas are powerless. God does not interpose, and the Republic is too strong. Nay, there is even a rumor that the Roman Pantheon may be secularized also, and changed into a national mausoleum where the youth of Italy may bend reverently before the tombs of such glorious soldiers of progress as Mazzini and Garibaldi, instead of honoring the very counterfeit presentment of fabulous old saints, chiefly renowned for their laziness and dirt. The Church of Saint Genevieve is desecrated, Christ the Archbishop of Paris, and special prayers are offered up to that ancient lady in heaven to avert her wrath from the infidel city which has so insulted her. In one sense, the Archbishop is right. The Church is desecrated in the strict etymological meaning of the word. It has been converted from sacred to secular uses. But in the secondary meaning of the word, the building is not desecrated, but honored by being made a fit receptacle for the mortal remains of Victor Hugo. A government decree and the removal of the cross on top of the church were the only steps necessary to its desecration. The consecrated character of the temple is gone. To the carnal eye, the structure remains unchanged, within and without, except for the loss of a crucifix. But it is quite possible that a priestly nose would be able to scent the absence of the Spirit. The Holy Ghost has fled, angels no more haunt the nave and aisles, and Saint Genevieve hides her poor head in grief and humiliation. No doubt. Yet we dare say the building will stand none the less firmly, and if it should ever be pulled down, its materials would fetch as much in the market as if they were saturated with divinity. Consecration is, after all, nothing but a priestly trick. What sensible man believes that the Holy Ghost, if such a being exist, is at the beck and call of every Catholic or Protestant bishop? Can the universal Spirit dwell exclusively in certain places? Can the third person of the Trinity have sunk into such an abject state as to dodge in and out of buildings according as he is wanted or not? Is there any difference that the nose or any other sensitive organ can detect between a consecrated church and an unconsecrated chapel? Can the geologist or the chemist discern any difference between the consecrated and the unconsecrated division in a cemetery? Is the earth affected by priestly mutterings? Do the corpses lie any more peacefully or decompose any more slowly for the words pronounced over the mold that covers them? Or is there any appreciable virtue in the consecrated water, with which the Protestant and Catholic are alike baptized, and with which the latter sprinkles himself periodically as a preservative against evil? Season finds no difference. It is perceived only by faith, which may be defined as the faculty which enables a man to see what does not exist. End of section 39. Recording by Scarbo.
Section 40 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by NoelVox. Flowers of Freethought by George William Foote, Section 40. Walt Whitman, April 1892. Walt Whitman's death can have taken no one by surprise. For years he had been at the brink of the grave, and the end comes as a relief. A great soul may be cheerful, or at least serene, in all circumstances, but there is neither pleasure nor dignity in living on as the ghost of one's self. Few superber specimens of physical manhood than Walt Whitman's have appeared on this planet. "He looks like a man," said Abraham Lincoln, as his gaze followed the poet past a window of the White House. Whitman stood 6 feet 2. His limbs and torso were splendid, and his head was magnificently proportioned. His vitality must have been wonderful, and his health was absolutely perfect until after the war, during which he too assiduously nursed the sick and wounded, to the lasting detriment of his phenomenal constitution. The flame of his life burnt on for another 30 years, but his strength was seriously undermined, and he is far better entitled to be called a martyr than many who have more cheaply earned the distinction. Walt Whitman's great personality can hardly be disputed. He impressed himself as something colossal on all who came into close contact with him. The magnetism of his presence in the military hospitals was more sanative than the doctor's physic. Men, women, and children felt glad and satisfied in his company. His large, frank, healthy nature radiated a perpetual benediction. One who knew him intimately has said that he never saw upon Whitman's features any trace of mean or evil passions. The man was thoroughly wholesome. Even his occasionally free utterances on sexuality are only sins against decorum. They do not violate nature. He never spoke on the subject with the slobbery grin of the voluptuary, or the leer of prurience. He was, at such moments, simply unreticent. Meaning no harm, he suspected none. In this respect he belonged to a less self-conscious antiquity, when nothing pertaining to man was common or unclean, and even the worship of the powers of generation was not without dignity and solemnity. Some of the foremost Englishmen of our time have acknowledged Whitman's greatness and sanity, notably Carlyle, Ruskin, and Tennyson. Mr. Swinburne is the only one who has unsaid his praise. Tennyson's intimacy with Whitman, always through correspondence, was simply beautiful. A superficial reader of human nature might have inquired what they had in common, the rough, amorphous American poet and the exquisite English poet, a flower of millenniums of culture. But there is something deeper than form. It is substance. There is something deeper than language. It is manhood. And on the common ground of the deeper things of life, the American and English poets, otherwise so diverse, clasped hands, as it were, across the sundering ocean. Whitman's claim to be considered a great poet, or even a poet at all, has been the subject of hot dispute, but such questions are not so settled. Only give time enough, and every writer falls by mere gravitation into his proper place, from which all the controversies in the world can never shift him. Where the evidence is largely subjective, as it must be in appraising genius, there is sure to be much in our judgment that is incommunicable. The logic of events, as we say in politics, or the proof of the pudding, as we say in the vernacular, is not so brilliant as logical swordplay, but it has the merit of being decisive. Whitman's poetry looks strange to a reader accustomed to conventional models. It positively offends his eyesight. The ear may detect a certain rhythm, but where are the set lengths of orthodox versification? Here, however, there lurks a fallacy. Poetry is not the antithesis of prose. The antithesis of prose is verse. Some of the finest and noblest poetry in the world's literature is not cast in rhyme, though rhythm, often subtler than all possible rules, is indispensable. Yet there is something precious in poetical form, Aye, and something durable. Many an exquisite lyric, with no great depth of feeling or reach of thought, has come down the stream of time, and will float upon it forever. No doubt Dr. Johnson was right in calling it a waste of time to carve cherry stones, but precious stones are all the more valued and admired for the art of the lapidary. Whitman did not cultivate versification. He almost despised it. He sneered at dulcet rhymes. Yet this may hinder his access to posterity. Mr. Meredith hints as much in his sonnet entitled An Orson of the Muse, which surely refers to Whitman. He allows him to be the Muse's son, though he will not wear her livery. Quote, Him whom he blows of earth and man and fate, the Muse will hearken to with graver ear than many of her train can waken. Him would fain have taught that fruitful things endear must sink beneath the tide waves of their weight, if in no vessel built for sea they swim. That Whitman, however, could do great things with rhythm and without rhyme is proved by his funeral hymn of President Lincoln, which James Thomson ranked with Shelley's Adonais, and Mr. Swinburne called the most sublime nocturne ever chanted in the cathedral of the world. That this is a great poem and will live, we have not the slightest doubt. Some other of Whitman's poems will doubtless live with it, but whole masses of his poetry will probably sink to the bottom, not, however, before doing their work and delivering their message. Because of his want of form, Whitman suffers more than other poets in extracts. We shall make none, but refer the reader to the whole body of his poetry. Some of it is almost wearisome, the rest will repay study. It contains the utterance of a great soul, full of love and friendship, patriotism and humanity, brewing over the everlasting problems of life and death. Untrammeled by schools and systems, Whitman was a true freethinker. Cosmopolitan as he was, he preached the gospel of individuality. This is what you shall do. Love the earth, and the sun, and the animals, despise riches, give alms to everyone that asks, stand up for the stupid and the crazy, devote your income and labor to others, hate tyrants, argue not concerning God, have patience and indulgence towards the people, take off your hat to nothing known or unknown, or to any man or number of men, go freely with powerful uneducated persons, and with the young and mothers of families, re-examine all you have been told at school or church or in any book, dismiss whatever insults your own soul, and your very flesh shall be a great poem, and have the richest fluency, not only in its words, but in the silent lines of its lips and face, and between the lashes of your eyes, and in every motion and joint of your body. Whitman appealed to the brotherhood of all, and the dignity of each. He declared he would have nothing which every other man might not have on equal terms. The business of the great poet was, quote, to cheer up slaves and horrify despots. Men, too, should keep in close communion with nature, yet always feel that they could, quote, be good or grand only of the consciousness of the supremacy within them. What do you think is the grandeur of storms and dismemberments, and the deadliest battles and wrecks, and the wildest fury of the elements, and the power of the sea, and the motion of nature, and of the throes of human desires, and dignity, and hate, and love? It is that something in the soul which says, rage on, whirl on, I tread, master here, and everywhere, master of the spasms of the sky and of the shatter of the sea, of all terror and all pain. America, perhaps even more than England, has need of Whitman's teaching as the poet of democracy. He derided, quote, the mania of owning things, end quote. He scorned distinctions of caste and class. He sang the divineness of comradeship, and what is more, he practiced it. Full-blooded, strong-limbed, rich-brained, large-hearted men and women are a nation's best products, and if a nation does not yield them, its wealth will only hasten its doom and pollute its grave. End of section 40. Recording by NoelVox.
Section 41 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chris Pyle. Flowers of Freethought by George William Foote. Section 41. Tennyson and the Bible. October, 1892. We owe no apology for speaking of the dead poet as Tennyson. This is how he will be known by posterity. The rank is but the guinea's stamp, and in this case it was not requisite. A true poet's gold can neither be made more precious nor more current by empty titles. In our opinion, it is a degradation instead of an honor, For one of nature's aristocrats to herd with the artificial nobility of an hereditary peerage. We also take the opportunity of regretting that Tennyson ever became poet laureate. The court poet should not survive the court dwarf and the court jester. It is painful to see a great writer grinding out professional odes and bestowing the excrements of his genius on royal nonentities. The preposterous office of poet laureate should now be abolished. No poet should ever write for a clique or a coterie. He should appeal directly to the heart of the nation. Tennyson's funeral took place at Westminster Abbey. The heads of that establishment, following the example set by Dean Stanley, now act as body snatchers. They appropriate the corpses of distinguished men, whether they believed or disbelieved the doctrines of the service read over their coffins. Charles Darwin's body is buried there, the great agnostic, who repudiated Christianity. Robert Browning's too, the poet who said, "I am no Christian," to Robert Buchanan. Carlyle took care that his corpse should not join the museum. Tennyson's, however, is now in the catalogue, and it must be admitted with more plausibility than in the case of Browning, with far more than in the case of Darwin. Christian pulpiteers all over the country have been shouting their praises of Tennyson as a Christian poet. They are justified in making the most of a man of genius when they possess one. We do not quarrel with them. We only beg to remark that they have overdone it. The Christianity of Tennyson is a very different thing from the Christianity they vend to the credulous multitude. There is no real evidence that Tennyson accepted the legendary part of Christianity. Even in In Memoriam, which was published 43 years ago, the thought is often extremely pantheistic. It is nearly always so in the later poems. God, not Christ, became more and more the object of the poet's adoration. Strong Son of God, immortal love, the first line of the earlier poem, does not necessarily mean Christ, while the exclamation, "Ring in the Christ that is to be," is more symbolic than personal. There is also a strong hope, rather than the certitude of a future life. No thoroughly convinced Christian could have written of the shadow cloaked from head to foot, who keeps the keys of all the creeds. Nay, the very deity of Christ is held loosely, if at all, in the 33rd section, where he whose faith has centre everywhere, nor cares to fix itself to form, is bidden to leave his sister undisturbed when she prays, the poet exclaiming, "O sacred be the flesh and blood to which she links a truth divine." In the last line of the next stanza, this sacred flesh and blood of Christ, it is to be presumed, is called a type, which is a wide departure from Orthodox Christianity. And what shall we say of the final lines of the whole poem? One God, one law, one element, and one far-off divine event to which the whole creation moves. Like other passages of In Memoriam, it is a distinct anticipation of the thought of the higher pantheism, flower in the crannied wall, De Profundis, and the ancient sage. Much has been made of the pilot in one of Tennyson's last poems, Crossing the Bar. I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. This has been treated as a reference to Christ, but a friend of Tennyson's, writing in the Athenaeum, says that the reference was really to the poet's son, Lionel Tennyson, who crossed the bar of death some years previously. How much more natural and human is the reference in the light of this explanation? Yet it appears, after all, from a later letter to the press by Tennyson's surviving son, that he did mean Christ. This is not, however, a confession of orthodoxy. The sentiment might be shared by men like the venerable Dr. Martino, who deny the deity of Christ and strongly dissent from many time-honored Christian teachings. Tennyson most assuredly revolted against the brutalities of Christianity, which, by the way, are countenanced by the very explicit text in the New Testament. He did not approve the text, "Great is your reward in heaven." He was above such huckstering. He sang of virtue. She desires no isles of the blest, no quiet seats of the just, to rest in a golden grove or to bask in a summer sky. Give her the wages of going on and not to die. A noble petition, though in the teeth of a too patent destiny. The doctrine of eternal hell he first turned from, then denounced, and finally despised. It was for wavering as to this hideous dogma that the Reverend F.D. Maurice got into trouble with his college. He was godfather to Tennyson's little boy, and the poet invited him, in exquisitely charming verse, to share his hospitality. For being of that honest few, who give the fiend himself his due, should 80,000 college councils thunder anathema, friend, at you, should all our churchmen foam in spite at you so careful of the right, yet one lay hearth would give you welcome, take it and come to the Isle of Wight. Tennyson had already, in memoriam, proclaimed himself a Universalist, as Browning did afterwards in his powerful lines on the old morgue at Paris. He had expressed the hope that nothing walks with aimless feet, that not one life should be destroyed or cast as rubbish to the void, when God hath made the pile complete, that not a worm is cloven in vain, that not a moth with vain desire is shriveled in a fruitless fire, or but subserves another's gain. Such a poet could never see the divinity of the wicked awful words, "Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire." He denounced it in Despair, a poem of his old age. Well does he make the agnostic cry out to the minister, "What, I should call on that infinite love that has served us so well? Infinite cruelty, rather, that made everlasting hell, made us, foreknew us, foredoomed us, and does what he will with his own. Better our dead brute mother, who never has heard us groan." This is fierce denunciation, but it pales before the attack on hell in Rizpah. That splendid poem, which is perhaps the very noblest effort of Tennyson's genius, outweighing hundreds of balaclava charges and sea fights, outshining the flawless perfection of Maud, a poem written in heart's blood and immortal tears with a wondrously potent and subtle imagination, and a fire of humanity to burn up whole mountains of brutal superstitions. The passionate words of the poor old dying mother, full of a deathless love for her boy who was hung, go straight as an arrow to its mark, through all the conventions of society and all the teachings of the church. Election, election and reprobation, it's all very well, but I go tonight to my boy, and I shall not find him in hell. If he be lost, but to save my soul, that is all your desire. Do you think that I care for my soul if my boy be gone to the fire? Tennyson gives the very essence of the moral revolt against hell. Human nature has so developed in sympathy that the sufferings of others, though out of sight, afflict our imaginations. We loathe the spectacle of Abraham and Lazarus gazing complicitly on the torture of Dives. Once it was not so. Those who were saved had little or no care for the damned. But the best men and women of today do not want to be saved alone. They want a common salvation or none. And the mother's heart, which the creeds have trampled upon, hates the thought of any happiness in heaven, while son or daughter is agonizing in hell. It is perfectly clear that Tennyson was far from an orthodox Christian. Quite as certainly he was not a bibliolater. He read the Bible, of course, and so did Shelley. There are fine things in it, amidst its falsehoods and barbarities, and the English version is a monument of our literature. We regard as apocryphal, however, the story of Tennyson's telling a boy, "Read the Bible and Shakespeare. The one will teach you how to speak to God, and the other how to speak to your fellow men." Anyhow, when the poet came to die, he did not ask for the Bible, and he did ask for Shakespeare. The copy he habitually used was handed to him. He opened it at Cymbeline, one of the most pagan of Shakespeare's plays. He read a little, and then held the book until death came with the fall of tired eyelids upon tired eyes. It was a poetic death, and a pagan death. There lay the aged, world-weary poet, artificial light was withdrawn, and the moonlight streamed through the window upon his noble figure. Wife and sons, doctors and nurses were silent around him. And his death put the last cold touch on the once passionate heart. It found him still clasping the book of the mighty magician. Let it be also noted that no Christian priest was at his bedside. He needed not the mumblings of a smaller soul to aid him in his last extremity. Hope he may have had, but no fear. His life ended, like a long summer day slowly dying into night. End of section 41. Recording by Chris Pyle.
Section 42 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eric Whitman, St. Charles, Illinois. Flowers of Freethought by George William Foote. Section 42, Christ's Old Coat. The little town of Trier, Trevis, will soon wear a festive appearance. Pilgrims will be flocking to it from all parts of Germany and God knows from where besides. Its handful of inhabitants have obtained licenses to open hotels and restaurants. Every inch of available space has been let, so that whirligigs, panoramas, and menageries have to be refused the sites they apply for. Every room in the town is to be let, more or less furnished. And not only is the tram company doubling its line, but the railway company is constructing special stations for special trains. All this excitement springs from a superstitious source. After an interval of several years, the church will once more exhibit an old rag, which it calls the Holy Coat, and which it pretends is the very garment we read of in the Gospels. Such a precious relic is, of course, endowed with supernatural qualities. It will heal the sick, cure cripples, and, let us hope, put brains into idiotic heads. Hence the contemplated rush to Trier, where more people will congregate to see Christ's coat than ever assembled to hear him preach or see him crucified. The pilgrims will not be allowed to examine the Holy Coat. Few of them, perhaps, would be inclined to do so. They have the faith which removes mountains, and swallowing a coat is but a trifle. Nor would the church allow a close inspection of this curious relic, any more than it would allow a chemist to examine the bottle in which the blood of St. Januarius annually liquefies. The Holy Coat will be held up by priests at a discreet and convenient distance. The multitude of fools will fall before it in ecstatic adoration, and the result will be the usual one in such cases, a lightening of the devotees' pockets to the profit of Holy Mother Church. According to the Gospels, the prophet of Nazareth had a seamless overcoat. Perhaps it was presented to him by one of the rich women who ministered unto him of their substance. Perhaps it was a birthday gift from Joseph of Arimathea. Anyhow, he had it, unless the Gospels lie, and with the rest of his clothes it became the property of his executioners. Those gentlemen raffled for it. Which of them won, we are not informed. Nor are we told what he did with it. It would be a useless garment to a Roman soldier, and perhaps the warrior who won the raffle sold it to a second-hand clothes dealer. This, however, is merely a conjecture. Nothing is known with certainty. The seamless overcoat disappeared from view as decisively as the person who wore it. For many hundreds of years, it was supposed to have gone the way of other coats. No one thought it would ever be preserved in a church museum. But somehow it turned up again, and the church got possession of it, though the church could not tell how and when it was found or where it had been while it was lost. One coat disappeared. Hundreds of years afterwards, another coat was found, and it suited the church to declare them the same. At that time, the church was discovering relics with extraordinary success and rapidity. Almost everything Christ ever used, or didn't use, came to light. His baby linen, samples of his hair and teeth, and the milk he drew from Mary's breast, the shoes he wore into Jerusalem, fragments of the 12 baskets full of food after the miracle of the loaves and fishes, the dish from which he ate the Last Supper, the thorns that crowned his brow, the sponge put to his lips on the cross, pieces of the cross itself. These and a host of other relics were treasured at various churches in Europe and exhibited with unblushing effrontery. Even the prepuce of Jesus, amputated at his circumcision, was kept at Rome. Several churches boasted the same articles. John the Baptist's body was in dozens of different places, and the finger with which he pointed to Jesus as his successor was shown in a fine state of preservation at Besançon, Toulouse, Lyon, Bourges, Mâcon, and many other towns. John Calvin pointed out in his grim treatise on relics that the Holy Coat of Christ was kept in several churches, In our own time, a book on this subject has been written by H. von Seibel, who proves that the Triar coat is only one of 20 that were exhibited. All were authentic, and all were guaranteed by the same authority. Holy Mother Church lied and cheated without a twinge of compunction. 19 holy coats have gone. The 20th is the last of the tribe. While it pays, it will be exhibited. When it ceases to pay, the church will quietly drop it. By and by, the church will swear it never kept such an article in stock. Superstition dies hard, and it always dies viciously. The ruling passion is strong in death. A journalist has just been sent to prison for casting a doubt on the authenticity of this holy coat. Give the Catholic Church its old power again, and all who laughed at its wretched humbug would be choked with blood. Protestants as well as freethinkers laugh at Catholic relics. Were we to quote from some of the old English reformers who carried on a vigorous polemic against Catholic idolatry, we should be reproached for soiling our pages unnecessarily. John Calvin himself, the Genevan Pope, declared that so many samples of the Virgin Mary's milk were exhibited in Europe that one might suppose she was a wet nurse or a cow. Freethinkers, however, laugh at the miracles of Protestantism, as well as those of the Catholic Church. They are all of a piece in the ultimate analysis. It is just as credible that Christ's coat would work miracles as that Elisha's bones restored a corpse to life, or that Paul's handkerchiefs cured the sick and diseased. All such things belong to the same realm of pious imagination. Thus, while the Protestant laughs at the Catholic, the Freethinker laughs at both. End of section 42.
Section 43 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Yearsley. Flowers of Freethought by George William Foote. Section 43. Christ's Coat, Number 2. Jesus Christ is urgently required on earth again, to settle the pious dispute between Trèves and Argenté as to which possesses the real seamless coat that was taken from him at the crucifixion and raffled for by the Roman soldiers. No one but the second person of the Trinity, unless it be the first or third person of that three-headed monstrosity, is adequate to the settlement of this distracting quarrel. Even the papacy, which represents the Holy Trinity on earth, is at variance with itself. Pope Leo favours Trèves, and the wicked pilgrims who visit that little old town are to obtain absolution, if they do not forget to pray for the extirpation of erroneous doctrines. Pope Pius, his predecessor, however, favoured Argenté. A portion of the holy coat, treasured in the church there, was sent to him, and in return for the precious gift, he forwarded a well-blessed and marvellously decorated wax taper, which is still on show in a fine state of preservation. When popes differ, ordinary people, like pious Christians and even the editors of Freethought journals, may be excused if they hesitate to commit themselves. One of these coats may be the true one, though the evidence is all against it, being in fact of such a shaky nature that it would hardly suffice to substantiate a claim to a bunch of radishes. But both of them cannot be authentic, and the problem is, which is the very coat that Jesus wore? Now, it is obvious that no one, barring his two colleagues aforesaid, can possibly determine this question but himself. His reappearance on earth is therefore most desirable. Nay, it is absolutely necessary, unless a lot of people who would fain bow before the cast-off clothes of their Redeemer are either to stay at home in a state of dubiety or to incur the risk of kneeling before a mouldy old rag that perchance belonged to a Moorish slave or a Syrian water-carrier, in any case to a dog of an infidel, who spat at the very name of Christ, for such raiment was never worn by the worshippers of the Nazarene. If Christ is coming to decide this great and grave problem, he will have to make haste, for Argenteuil is already on the warpath. Its holy coat is being exhibited before that of Trèves, and thousands of pilgrims are giving number 2 the preference. Presently the Trèves relic will attract its thousands, and the spectacle will be positively scandalous. 2 Richmonds in the field were nothing to 2 Christ's coats, each pretending to be the real article, and each blessed by a pope. For the sake of decency as well as truth, Christ should peremptorily interfere. It is difficult to see how he can refrain. The second advent may therefore be expected before the date assigned by Prophet Baxter, and we shall probably soon hear the faithful singing, "Lo, he comes in clouds descending." Why should he not come? We may ask the Catholics. His mother has often appeared, if we may believe the solemn affidavits of priests and bishops, backed up by the Holy See. Why should he not come? We may also ask the Protestants. His second coming is an article of their faith. It is plainly taught in the New Testament, and was recently propounded by Mr. Spurgeon as part of the irreducible minimum of the Christian faith. That he will come, then, may be taken for granted. And what better opportunity could be desired than the present? Surely the faithful all over Europe, aye, and in America, to say nothing of Asia, Africa, and Australia, will cry like one man, "Come, Lord Jesus, quickly come. Tell us, oh tell us which of these mouldy old rags did once grace thy holy shoulders. Save us, oh save us from the pain, the ignominy of adoring a dirty relic of some unknown sinner, who perhaps blasphemed thy holy name. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord." Meanwhile, we may point out that if Christ does not come and adjudicate between Trèves and Argenteuil, a multitude of Christians will certainly go on a fool's errand. Our private opinion is that all will do so who visit either of these places. Nevertheless, they will no doubt congratulate themselves, if they go to Trèves, on winning absolution. The Holy Father at Rome, who has a supernatural dispensing power, promises to wipe out the record of their sins. Liars, cheats, seducers, adulterers, and undetected assassins may take a trip, perform genuflections before something in a glass case, and return home with a clean record. Who can conceive an easier method of avoiding the consequences of wickedness? As for the prayer which the pilgrims are to offer up for the extirpation of erroneous doctrines, it will cost them very little effort, for sinners who are washed clean with such delightful celerity are not likely to be in love with erroneous doctrines that declare the Pope's dispensing power a sham, and sternly tell men that the consequences of action, whether good or bad, are inevitable. We very much doubt, however, if erroneous doctrines will disappear through the prayers of the pilgrims or the curses of the Pope. Scepticism will probably gain by the spectacle of 2 rival coats of Christ, both exhibited at the same time, both attracting crowds of devotees, and both enjoying the papal blessing. It will bring superstition into still further contempt, and promote the rejection of a creed which has ever traded on ignorance and credulity. End of section 43.
Section 44 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tommy Hersant, Carlsbad, California. Flowers of Freethought by George William Foote, Section 44. Scotched, not slain. Those who have read the foregoing articles on the Holy Coat exhibitions at Trèves and Argenterie may think that enough space has been devoted to such a ridiculous subject. It is possible, however, that the present article will induce them to alter that opinion. Hitherto we have treated this outburst of Christian superstition with jocosity, but there is a serious aspect of it which must not be neglected. Christianity has often made freethinkers laugh, but not unfrequently it has made them weep tears of blood. Absurdity is not always a laughing matter. There was a comic side to the orthodox persecution of Charles Bradlaugh, but it killed him. Bigotry and superstition are fit subjects for jest and ridicule. When they gain power, however, they are apt to substitute agony for laughter. Celsus ridiculed Christianity in the 2nd century. In the 4th, his writings were absolutely destroyed, and those who shared his opinions and dared to express them were on the high road to the prison and the stake. More recent events teach the same lesson. Thomas Paine treated Christianity not only with trenchant argument, but also with brilliant derision. For this he suffered ostracism and calumny, and for publishing The Age of Reason, Richard Carlile, his wife, his sister, and his shopman rotted in English jails. The Freethinker derided Christian absurdities, and its conductors were sent to herd with criminals in a Christian prison. Nearly everybody thought, as Sir James Stephen declared in a legal textbook, that the blasphemy laws were obsolete, but it was proved by the inexorable logic of fact that laws are never obsolete until they are repealed. While the blasphemy laws exist, they are always liable to enforcement. They are the standing menace of an absurd creed to those who smile at it too ostentatiously. Let us extend the same line of reflection to this holy coat business. Contemptible as it is to the eye of reason, it excites the piety of millions of persons who never reasoned on religion in their whole course of their lives. Hundreds of thousands of men and women will visit these sham relics of a Savior whose own existence is open to dispute. Superstition will be stirred to its depths. The bestial instinct of spiritual slavery, inherited from ancient semi-human progenitors, will be intensely stimulated. The sacred function of priests will be heightened and intensified. Nor must it be forgotten that the pecuniary offerings of the pilgrims will fill the coffers of Holy Mother Church, who promises heaven to her dupes, and seizes wealth and power for herself on earth. Superstition is scotched but not slain. It has life enough to be a peril to civilization. The faith which wrecked the grandeur that was Greece and the glory that was Rome, the faith which buried the science, art, philosophy, and literature of antiquity under a monstrous heap of brutal rubbish, out of which they were slowly and painfully excavated after the lapse of 1,000 years, this same faith is still a danger to the highest welfare of mankind, to its reason, its conscience, its sense of dignity, and its spirit of brotherhood. Above all, to freedom of thought, which is the sole guarantee of real and durable progress. If we turn to Russia, we see at a single glance the fruits of superstition and its twin sister, tyranny. The Tsar is the head of the Church and the head of the state. not like Queen Victoria, whose sacred function is only indicated in Latin on our coinage, but in literal, prosaic fact. By means of a swarm of ignorant and often drunken and immoral priests, the masses of the people are kept in wretched subjection. Hewers of wood and drawers of water, toilers for the huge army of officials, aristocrats and princes, and conscripts for the army. While the best and noblest, in whom there still throbs the pulse of freedom, blacken the highways to the mines of Siberia, where hell is more than realized on earth, and the dreams of sour-blooded theologians are outdone in misery and horror. Over the rest of Europe, even in France, the secular state is often as insecure as the footsteps of travelers over thin crusts of volcanic soil. Bismarck, the Titan, whose great work, with all its defects and failings, may appeal from the clamorous passing hour to the quaint verdict of history, only kept the Catholic Church and its Jesuits in check for a generation. He could not impair its vitality, nor diminish its latent power. It is in Germany that the coat of Christ is being exhibited, with priests and professors joining hands at the brazen ceremony of imposture. In Germany, that myriads of pilgrims are wending their way to the shrine of an idolatry as ignominious as anything that Christianity ever supplanted. Even in France, the one great danger to the Republic is Christian superstition. It is the Church, her priests and her devotees, that furnish the real strength of every reactionary movement. That consummate charlatan, General Boulanger, took to going to church and cultivating orthodoxy when at the height of his aspiration for power. Happily, he was defeated by the men of light and leading. Happily, too, the ablest and most trusted leaders of public life in France are on the side of free thought. It is this, more than anything else, that makes the country of Voltaire the beacon of civilization as well as the martyr of democracy. Charles Bradlaugh, on a very solemn occasion, warned the Freethought party that even in England their great fight would ultimately be with the Catholic Church. He knew that superstition was scotched, but he also knew it was far from slain. While freethinkers are laughing at this exhibition of old rags called the coat of Christ, they should pause for a moment to consider the serious meaning of such a grotesque display of superstition in the land of Goethe and Heine, and in the age of Darwin. Let us jest about our campfires, but let us grip our sword hilts as we hear the cries, the jingle of weapons, and the tramp of men in the camp of our enemy. End of section 44. Reading by Tommy Hersant, Carlsbad, California.
Section 45. Flowers of Free Thought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Fournier, Marshall, Virginia, USA. Flowers of Free Thought by George William Foote. Section 45. God-making. Man is certainly stark mad. He cannot make a flea, and yet he will be making gods by dozens. So wrote honest Montaigne, the first great skeptic in modern history, who was so far in advance of his age that he surprised the world by venturing to doubt whether it was after all a just and sensible thing to burn a man alive for differing from his neighbors. The history of that mental aberration which is called religion, and a survey of the present state of the world, from the fetish worshipper of Central Africa to the super-subtle theist of educated Europe, furnish us with countless illustrations of the truth of Montaigne's exclamation. God-making has always been a prevalent pastime, although it has less attraction for the modern than for the ancient mind. It was a recreation in which everyone could indulge, whether learned or illiterate, young or old, rich or poor. All the material needed to fashion gods of was ignorance, and there was always an unlimited stock of that article. The artificer was imagination, a glorious faculty, which is the highest dower of the creative artist and the scientific discoverer, and in their service is fruitful in usefulness and beauty, but which in the service of theology is a frightful curse, filling the mental world with fantastic monsters who waylay and devour. Common people, however, who did the work of the world, were not able to do much God-making. Their leisure and ability were both limited, but they had a large capacity for admiring the productions of others, and their deficiencies were supplied by a special class of men, called priests, who were set apart for the manufacture of deities, and who devoted their time and their powers to the holy trade. This pious division of labor, this specialization of function, still continues. Carpenters and tailors, grocers and butchers, who are immersed all the week in labor or business, have no opportunity for long excursions in the field of divinity, and therefore they take their religion at second hand from the priest on Sunday. It was not the multitude, but the sacred specialists, who built up the gigantic and elaborate edifice of theology, which is a purely arbitrary construction, deriving all its design and coherence from the instinctive logic of the human mind, that operates alike in a fairy tale and in a syllogism. Primitive man used conveniently shaped flints before he fashioned flint instruments, discovery always preceding invention. In like manner, he found gods before he made them. A charm resides in some natural object, such as a fish's tooth, a queer-shaped pebble, or a jewel, and it is worn as an amulet to favor and protect. This is fetishism. By and by, counterfeits are made of animals and men, or amalgams of both, and the fetishistic sentiment is transferred to these. This is the beginning of polytheism. And how far it extends, even into civilized periods, let the superstitions of Europe attest. The nun who tells her beads and the lady who wears an ornamental crucifix are to some extent fetishists, while the Catholic worship of saints is only polytheism in disguise. Reading the Bible with clear eyes, we see that the ancient Jews worshipped gods of their own making, which were handed down as family relics. When Jacob made tracks after sucking his uncle dry, Rachel carried off the poor old fellow's teraphim and left him without even a god to worship. Yahweh himself, who has since developed into God the Father, was originally nothing but an image in an ark. Micah, in the book of Judges, makes himself a houseful of gods and hires a Levite as his domestic chaplain. How long the practice persisted, we may judge from the royal scorn which Isaiah pours on the image-mongers, who hewed down cedars and cypresses, oaks and ashes, some for fuel and some for idols. Let us hear the great prophet. He burneth part thereof in the fire. With part thereof he eateth flesh. He roasteth roast, and is satisfied. Yea, he warmeth himself, and saith, Aha, I am warm. I have seen the fire. And the residue thereof he maketh a god, even his graven image. He falleth down unto it, and worshippeth it, and prayeth unto it, and saith, Deliver me, for thou art my God. 26 centuries have elapsed since Isaiah wrote that biting satire, yet image worship still prevails over 3/4 of the world. And even in Christian countries, to use Browning's phrase, we see God made and eaten every day. A wave of the hand and a muttered spell change bread or wafer and port wine into the body and blood of Christ, which are joyously consumed by his cannibal worshippers. Not even the higher divinities of the greater faiths are exempt from the universal law. They are not creatures of man's hand, yet they are creatures of his brain. What are they but his own fancies, brooded on till they become facts of memory and seem to possess an objective existence? The process is natural and easy. A figment of the imagination may become intensely real. Have we not a clearer idea of Hamlet and Othello than of half our closest acquaintances? Feuerbach went straight to the mark when he aimed to prove that the powers before which man crouches are the creatures of his own limited, ignorant, uncultured, and timorous mind, and that, in especial, the being whom man sets over against himself as a separate supernatural existence in his own being. Yes, all theology is anthropomorphism, the making of gods in man's image. What is the God of our own theology, as Matthew Arnold puts it, but a magnified man? We cannot transcend our own natures, even in imagination. We can only interpret the universe in the terms of our own consciousness, nor can we endow our gods with any other attributes than we possess ourselves. When we seek to penetrate the mystery of the infinite, we see nothing but our own shadow, and hear nothing but the echo of our own voice. As we are, so are our gods, and what man worships is what he himself would be. The placid Egyptian nature smiles on the face of the Sphinx. The gods of India reflect the terror of its heat and its beasts and serpents, the fertility of its soil, and the exuberance of its people's imagination. The glorious pantheon of Greece, Praxitelean shapes whose marble smiles fill the hushed air with everlasting love, embodies the wise and graceful fancies of the noblest race that ever adorned the earth, compared with whose mythology the Christian system is a hideous nightmare. The Roman gods wear a sterner look, befitting their practical and imperial worshippers, and Jove himself is the ideal genius of the eternal city. The deities of the old Scandinavians, whose blood tinges our English veins, were fierce and warlike as themselves, with strong hands, supple wrists, mighty thews, lofty stature, gray-blue eyes, and tawny hair. Thus has it ever been. So man created God in his own image. In the image of man created he him. Male and female created he them. End of section 45. Section 46 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Fournier, Marshall, Virginia, USA. Flowers of Freethought by George William Foote, Section 46. God and the Weather. With characteristic inconsistency, the Christian will exclaim, "Here is another blasphemous title. What has God to do with the weather?" Everything, sir. Not a sparrow falls to the ground without his knowledge. And do you think he fails to regulate the clouds? The hairs of your head are numbered. And do you think he cannot count the raindrops? Besides, your clergy pray for a change in the weather when they find it necessary. And to whom do they pray but God? True, they are getting chary of such requests, but the theory is not disavowed. Nor can it be unless the Bible is discarded as waste paper, and the forms of supplication for rain and fine weather still remain in the prayer book, although many parsons must feel like the parish clerk who asked, "What's the use of praying for rain with the wind in that quarter?" We might also observe that as God is omnipotent, he does everything, or at least everything which is not left, as parsons would say, to man's free will. And clearly the weather is not included in that list. God is also omniscient, and what he foresees and does not alter is virtually his own work. Even if a tile drops on a man's head in a gale of wind, it falls, like the sparrow, by a divine rule. And it is really the Lord who batters the poor fellow's skull. An action for assault would undoubtedly lie, if there were any court in which the case could be pleaded. What a frightful total of damages would be run up against the defendant if every plaintiff got a proper verdict. For, besides all the injuries inflicted on mankind by accident, which only means the Lord's malice or neglect, it is a solemn fact, on the theist's hypothesis, that God has killed every man, woman, and child that ever died since the human race began. We are born here without being consulted, and hurried away without the least regard to our convenience. But let us keep to the weather. A gentleman who was feeding the fish at sea heard a sailor singing, "Britannia rules the waves." "Does she?" he groaned. "And I wish she'd rule them straighter." Most of us might as fervently wish that the Lord ruled the weather better. Some parts of the world are parched and others flooded. In some places the crops are spoiled with too much sun, and in others with too little. Some people sigh for the sight of a cloud, and others see nothing else. Occasionally a famine occurs in India, which might have been averted by half our superfluity of water. Even at home, the weather is always more or less of a plague. Its variation is so great that it is always a safe topic of conversation. You may go out in the morning with a light heart, tempted by the sunshine to leave your overcoat and umbrella at home, and in the evening you may return wet through, with a sensation in the nose that prognosticates a doctor's bill. You may enter a theater or a hall with dry feet, and walk home through a deluge. In the morning a south wind breathes like zephyr on your cheeks, and in the evening your face is pinched with a vile and freezing northeaster. "Oh," say the pious, "it would be hard to please everybody, and foolish to try it. Remember the old man and his ass." Perhaps so. But the Lord should have thought of that before he made us. And if he cannot give us all we want, he might show us a little consideration now and then. But instead of occasionally accommodating the weather to us, he invariably makes us accommodate ourselves to the weather. That is, if we can. But we cannot, at any rate in a climate like this. Men cannot be walking almanacs, nor carry about a wardrobe to suit all contingencies. In the long run, the weather gets the better of the wisest and toughest, and when the doctors have done with us, we head our own funeral procession. The doctor's certificate says asthma, bronchitis, pulmonary consumption, or something of that sort. But the document ought to read, "Died of the weather." Poets have sung the glory of snowy landscapes, and there is no prettier sight than the earth covered with a virgin mantle, on which the trees gleam like silver jewels. But what an abomination snow is in cities! The slush seems all the blacker for its whiteness, and the pure flakes turn into the vilest mud. Men and horses are in a purgatory. Gloom sits on every face. Pedestrians trudge along, glaring at each other with murderous eyes, and the amount of swearing done is enough to prove the whole thing a beastly mistake. It seems perfectly clear that when the Lord designed the weather, 200 or 300 million years ago, he forgot that men would build cities. He continues to treat us as agriculturalists, even in a manufacturing and commercial country like this. Why should people get drenched in Fleet Street while the Buckinghamshire farmers want rain? The arrangement is obviously stupid. God Almighty ought to drop the rain and snow in the country and only turn on enough water in the cities to flush the sewers. He ought also to let the rain fall in the night. During the daytime, we want the world for our business and pleasure, and the rain department should operate when we are snug in bed. This is a reforming age. Gods, as well as men, must move on. It is really ridiculous for the clerk of the weather to be acting on the old lines, when everybody down below can see they are behind the time. If he does not improve, we shall have to agitate on the subject. Home rule is the order of the day. We need home for the globe, and we cannot afford to let the weather be included in the imperial functions. It is a domestic affair. and as the Lord has considerably mismanaged it, he had better hand it over to us, with full power to arrange it as we please. End of section 46. Section 47 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Fournier, Marshall, Virginia, USA. Flowers of Freethought by George William Foote, Section 47. Miracles. What is a miracle? Some people would reply, an act of God. But this definition is far too wide. In the theistic sense, it would include everything that happens. And in the sense of our archaic bills of lading, it would include fire and shipwreck. Others would reply, a miracle is a wonder. But this definition would include every new, or at least every surprising, new fact. A black swan would have been a wonder before Australia was discovered, but it would have been no miracle. Railways, telegraphs, telephones, electric light, and even gaslight would be wonders to savages, yet neither are they miracles. One of the Mahdi's followers was astonished by an English officer who pulled out his false eye, tossed it in the air, caught it, and replaced it, after which he asked the flabbergasted Arab whether his miraculous Mahdi could do that. It was a greater wonder than the Mahdi could perform. Still, it was not a miracle. Ice was so great a wonder to the king of Siam that he refused to credit its existence. Yet it was not miraculous, but a natural product existing in practically unlimited quantities in the polar regions. We might multiply these illustrations ad infinitum, but what we have given will suffice. If not, let the reader spend an evening at Maskelyne and Cook's, where he will see plenty of startling wonders, and not a miracle amongst them. Hume's definition of a miracle as a violation of a law of nature is the best ever given, and it really is as perfect as such a definition can be. It has been carped at by Christian scribblers and criticized by superior theologians like Moseley. But, to use Mr. Gladstone's phrase, it keeps the field. Even the criticisms of Mill and Huxley leave its merit unimpaired. The ground taken by these is that to say a miracle is a violation of a law of nature is to prejudge the question, and to rule out all future facts in the interests of a prepossession. Mill, however, allows that a miracle is a violation of a valid induction, and as a law of nature means nothing more, it is difficult to understand why he takes any exception to Hume's statement of the case. It is perfectly obvious that Hume's argument is not metaphysical, but practical. He does not discuss the possibility, but the probability of miracles. He reduces the dispute to a single point, namely, whether the person who relates a miracle, for to the world at large the question is necessarily one of testimony, is deceived or deceiving, or whether the otherwise universal experience of mankind is to be disbelieved. In other words, whether he or the rest of the world is mistaken. One man may, of course, be right, and all the human race opposed to him wrong, but time will settle the difference between them. That time, however, simply means general experience through long ages, and that is precisely the tribunal which Hume's argument appeals to. Quarreling with Hume's definition is really giving up miracles altogether, for, except as supernatural evidence, they are no more important than shooting stars. The very nature of a miracle, in whatever formula it may be expressed, is superhuman, and having a purpose, it is also supernatural. In other words, it is a special manifestation of divine power for a particular object. Whether, being so, it is a violation, a contravention, or a suspension of the laws of nature, is a mere question about words. We may say that a miracle has three elements. It is first a fact, unaccountable by science. Secondly, it requires a conscious agent. And thirdly, It results from the exercise of a power which that agent does not naturally possess. Let us descend to illustration. Huxley takes the following case. Suppose the greatest physiologist in Europe alleged that he had seen a centaur, a fabulous animal, half man and half horse. The presumption would be that he was laboring under hallucination. But if he persisted in the statement, he would have to submit to the most rigorous criticism by his scientific colleagues before it could be believed. And everybody would feel sure beforehand that he would never pass through the ordeal successfully. The common experience, and therefore the common sense, of society would be dead against him, and probably he would be refused the honor of examination even by the most fervid believers in ancient miracles. But after all, the centaur, even if it existed, would not be a miracle, but a monstrosity. It does not contain the three elements we have indicated. Real miracles would be of a different character. Plenty may be found in the Bible, and we may make a selection to illustrate our argument. Jesus Christ was once at a marriage feast, when the wine ran short, which was perhaps no uncommon occurrence. Being of a benevolent turn of mind, and anxious that the guest should remember the occasion, he turned a large quantity of cold water into fermented juice of the grape. Now, water contains oxygen and hydrogen in definite proportions, and nothing else, while wine contains, in addition to these, carbon and other elements, being in fact a very complex liquid. Jesus Christ must, therefore, in turning water into wine, have created something, and that transcends human power. Here, then, we have a complete miracle, according to Hume's definition and our own theory. We do not say the miracle never occurred, although we no more believe in it than we believe the moon is made of green cheese. We are willing to regard it as susceptible of proof. But does the proof exist? To answer this, we must inquire what kind of proof is necessary. An extraordinary story should be supported by extraordinary evidence. It requires the concurrent and overwhelming testimony of eyewitnesses. We must be persuaded that there is no collusion between them, that none of them has anything to gain by deception, that they had no previous tendency to expect such a thing, and that it was practically impossible that they could be deluded. Now, let any man or any Christian seriously ask himself whether the evidence for Jesus Christ's miracle is of this character. 4 evangelists write his life, and only one mentions the occurrence. Even he was certainly not an eyewitness, nor does he pretend to be, and the weight of evidence is against his gospel having been written till long after the first disciples of Jesus were dead. But even if the writer distinctly declared himself an eyewitness, and if it were undeniable that he lived on the spot at the time, his single, unsupported testimony would be absurdly inadequate to establish the truth of the miracle. Every reader will at once see that the established rules of evidence are not conformed to, and whoever accepts the miracle must eke out reason with faith. So much for the evidence of miracles. Their intellectual or moral value is simply nil. The greatest miracle could not really convince a man of what his reason condemned. And if a prophet could turn water into wine, it would not necessarily follow that all he said was true. In fact, truth does not require the support of miracles. It flourishes better without their assistance. Universal history shows that miracles have always been employed to support falsehood and fraud, to promote superstition, and to enhance the profit and power of priests. End of section 47.
Section 48 of Flowers of Freethought, first series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in September 2020. Flowers of Freethought by George William Foote. Section 48. A Real Miracle. May 1891. It is a common belief among Protestants, though not among Catholics, that the age of miracles is past. For a long time it has been very difficult to find a real case of special providence. There are stories afloat of wonderful faith cures, and the followers of John Wesley, as well as the followers of William Booth, often shake their heads mysteriously and affect to trace the hand of God in certain episodes of their experience. But such cases are too personal and too subjective to challenge criticism or inquiry. Investigating them is like exploring a cloud. There is nothing tangible for the mind to seize, nothing to stand by as the basis of discussion. What is wanted is a real objective miracle, a positive fact. Happily, such a miracle has come to the aid of a distressed Christianity. It is worth tons of learned apologetics, and will give the dying creed a fresh lease of life. Unfortunately, the world at large is in gross ignorance of this astonishing event. Like the earthquake, the eclipse, and the wholesale resurrection of saints at the crucifixion of Christ, it has excited very little public attention. But this dense apathy or satanic conspiracy of silence must not be allowed to hide a precious truth. We therefore do our best to give it publicly, although in doing so we are blasting our own foundations, for we belong to a party which boasts that it seeks for truth, and we are ready to exclaim, "Let truth prevail though the heavens fall." Most of our readers will remember the late accident on the Brighton line at Norwood. A bridge collapsed, and only the driver's presence of mind averted a great loss of life. Of course, the driver did his obvious duty, and presence of mind is not uncommon enough to be miraculous. But that does not exhaust the matter. The driver, Hargraves, is perfectly sure he received divine assistance. He is a man of pious habits. He never leaves his house without kneeling down with his wife and imploring God's protection. He never steps on the engine without breathing another prayer. On the morning of the accident, his piety was in a state of unusual excitation. He begged his wife to pray all that day, which we presume she did, with intervals for refreshment, and he knelt down himself in the passage before opening his front door. When the accident happened, he put the brake on and cried, "Lord, save us!" and according to the Christian world, it has since been stated by expert engineers that no train was ever before pulled up in such a short distance. A carping critic might presume to ask the names and addresses of these expert engineers. He might also have the temerity to inquire the precise distance in which the train was pulled up, the shortest distance in which other trains have been pulled up, and the weight and velocity of the train in each case. He might also meanly suggest that putting on the brake left as little as possible to Providence. For our part, however, we will not pursue such hypercriticism. It is applying to a miracle a test which it is not fitted to stand. Something must be left to faith, something must be reserved from reason, or the stoutest miracle would soon fall into a galloping consumption. The man in whom a pious disposition counteracts the restless play of thought will not demand absolute proof. He will only require an encouraging amount of evidence, and he will dutifully lift his face and hands to heaven, exclaiming, "Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief." The line we shall follow is a different one. Without questioning the miracle, we venture to ask why it was not more complete. Lives were saved, but several persons were injured. Was this due to the fact that Hargrave's prayer was not sufficiently above proof? Did the Lord answer the prayer according to its insensity? Was there a skeptic in the train who partially neutralized its effect? Or did the Lord proceed on the method favored by priests, preventing the miracle from being too obvious, but giving the incident a slightly supernatural appearance, in order to confirm the faith of believers without convincing the callous skeptics, whose deep sin of incredulity places them beyond the means of grace and the hope of glory? Nor are these questions exhaustive. Very much remains to be said. It appears that the Norwood Bridge collapsed through a secret flaw in the ironwork. Could not the Lord, therefore, in answer to Hargrave's prayers, which surely extended to the interests of his employers, have inspired one of the company's engineers with the notion of some unsoundness in the structure? This would have saved a good deal of property, and many passengers from suffering a shock whose effects may haunt them for years, and perhaps send them to untimely graves. Might not the Lord have cleared the roadway below, knocked down the bridge in the night, and brought someone to see the collapse who could have carried the tidings to the signalmen? Certainly there seems a remarkable want of subtlety in the ways of Providence. It looks as though the deity heard a prayer now and then, and jerked out a bit of miracle in a more or less promiscuous manner. What has happened to Providence since the Bible days? Miracles then were clear, convincing, and artistically rounded. You could not possibly mistake them for anything else. Balaam's ass, for instance, was not a performing moke. It does not appear to have known a single trick, and when it opened its mouth and talked in good Moabitish, the miracle was certain and triumphant. In the same way, the Norwood miracle might have been unadulterated with the usual operations of nature. The bridge might have collapsed as the train approached, Driver Hargraves might have said his prayer, the train might have leapt across the chasm, picked up the connection on the other side, and pursued its way to Brighton as if nothing had happened. But, as the case stands, Providence and the safety brake act together, and it is difficult to decide their shares in the enterprise. Further, the miracle is sadly mixed. Any human being would have planned it better, and made it stand out clearly and firmly. This Norwood miracle, however, seems the best obtainable in these days. It is a minute return for all the prayers of the clergy, to say nothing of pious engine drivers, a miserable dividend on the gigantic investment in supernaturalism. We pity the poor shareholders, though we must congratulate the directors on the large salaries they draw from the business. We also pity poor old Providence, who seems almost played out. Once upon a time he was in fine form, miracles were as common as blackberries, nature seldom got an innings, and Jehovah was all over the field. But nowadays nature seems to have got the better of him. She scarcely leaves him a corner for his operations, and what little he does, if he does anything, has to be done in obscurity. Poor old Providence, we fancy, has had his day. His vigour is gone, his lively fancy has degenerated into moking ineptitude. The shouts of millions of worshippers cannot stimulate his sluggishness into any more effective display than this Norwood miracle. More sincerely we offer him our condolence as the sleeping partner in the business of religion. By and by we may offer our condolence to the active partners, the priests of all denominations, who still flourish on a prospectus which, if once true, is now clearly fraudulent. When their business dwindles, in consequence of a failing supply of good supernatural articles, they will only live on the price of actual deliveries, and a Norwood miracle will hardly afford 6 of them a mouthful apiece. End of section 48.
Section 49 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tommy Hersant, Carlsbad, California. Flowers of Freethought, First Series by George William Foote, Section 49, Jesus on Women. For religions, says Michelet, woman is mother, tender guardian, and faithful nurse. The gods are like men. They are reared and they die upon her bosom. Truer words were never uttered. Michelet showed in La Sorcière, from which this extract is taken, as well as in many other writings, that he fully understood the fulcrum of priestcraft and the secret of superstition. Women are everywhere the chief, and in some places the only supporters of religion. Even in Paris, where freethinkers abound, the women go to church and favor the priest. Naturally, they impress their own views on the children, for while the father's influence is fitful through his absence from home, the mother's is constant and therefore permanent. Again and again the clergy have restored their broken power by the hold upon that sex which men pretend to think the weaker, although they are obviously the sovereigns of every generation. Men may resolve to go where they please, but if they cannot take the women with them, they will never make the journey. Women do not resist progress, they simply stand still, and by their real, though disguised, rule over the family, they keep the world with them. Freethinkers should look this fact in the face. Blinking it is futile. Whoever does that imitates the hunted ostrich, who does not escape his doom by hiding his head. The whole question lies in a nutshell. Where one sex is, the other will be. And there is a terrible, yet withal a beautiful truth in the upshot of Mill's argument that if men do not lift women up, women will drag men down. In the education and elevation of women, then, lies the great hope of the future. Leading freethinkers have always seen this. Shelley's great cry, "Can man be free if woman be a slave?" is one witness, and Mill's great essay on the subjection of women is another. Go where you will, you find the priests courting the women. They act thus not because they despise men or fear them, but because they, often unconsciously, feel that when they have captured the weaker sex, the other becomes a speedy prey. Perhaps a dim perception of this truth hovered in the minds of those who composed the story of the fall. The serpent does not bother about Adam. He just makes sure of Eve, and she settles her stronger half. Milton makes Adam reluct and wrangle, but it is easy to see he will succumb to his wife's persuasions. He swears he won't eat, but Eve draws him all the time with a silken string, mightier than the biggest cable. When the Christian monks were proselytizing in Rome, they were hated, says Jortin, quote, as beggarly impostors and hungry Greeks who seduce ladies of fortune and quality, unquote. Hated, yes, but what did the hatred avail? The women were won, and the game was over. Men growled, but they had to yield. The same holds good today. Watch the congregations streaming out of church. Count 10 bonnets to 1 hat, and you might fancy Christianity played out because the men stay at home and neglect its ministrations. Nothing of the sort. Men may desert the churches as they like, but while the women go, the clergy are safe. Examine the church and chapel organizations closely, and you will see how 9/10 of everything is designed for women and children. Yes, the bonnet is the priest's talisman. Like Constantine's legendary cross, it bears the sign, "By this conquer." On the other hand, the clergy never fail to remind women that religion is their best friend. Without our doctrines and our holy church, they say, there would be social chaos. The wild passions of men would spurn control. Marriage would be despised. Wives would become mistresses. Homes would disappear, and children would be treated as encumbrances. There is not a grain of truth in this, for religion has fomented, countenanced, or cloaked more sensuality and selfishness than it has ever repressed. But it is a powerful appeal to women's healthy domestic sentiment. She feels, if she does not know, that marriage is her sheet anchor, and the home an ark on a weltering flood. When the priest tells her that religion is the surety of both, he plucks at her heart, which vibrates to its depths, and she regards him as her Savior. Historically, the Christian religion, at least, has never been woman's real friend. It claims credit for everything, but what has it achieved? Monogamy was practiced by the rude Teutons before Christianity converted them by fraud and force, and it was the law in pagan Greece and Rome before the Christian era. Yet in the Bible there is not a word against polygamy. God's favorites had as many wives as they could manage, and Solomon had enough to manage him. In the New Testament, there is only one man who is told to be, quote, the husband of one wife, unquote, and that is a bishop. Even in his case, a facetious skeptic hints, and the Mormons argue, that the command only means that he must have one wife at least. There are two supreme figures in the New Testament, Paul and Jesus. What Paul says about women I will deal with presently. For the moment, I confine myself to Jesus. Let the reader remember that Christianity cannot transcend the Bible any more than a stream can rise above its source. Like most revivalists and popular preachers, Jesus had a number of women dangling at his heels. But his teaching on the subject in hand is barren or worse. As a child, he gave his mother the slip at Jerusalem and caused her much anxiety. During his ministry, when his mother and his brethren wished to speak with him, he forgot the natural ties of blood and coolly remarked that his family were those who believed his gospel. On another occasion, he roughly said to Mary, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" These examples are not very edifying. If Christ is our great exemplar, the fashion he set of treating his nearest relatives is, quote, more honored in the breach than in the observance, unquote. Jesus appears to have despised the union of the sexes, therefore marriage, and therefore the home. He taught that in heaven, where all are perfect, there is neither marrying nor giving in marriage. The saints, being like angels, probably of the neuter gender. In Matthew 19:12, he appears to recommend emasculation, praising those who make themselves, quote, eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake, unquote. This doctrine is too high for flesh and blood, but Origen and other early Christians practiced it literally. We may be sure that those who trample on a manhood have no real respect for womanhood. Hence, the Romish Church has always praised up virginity, which is simply an abnegation of sex. Cruden shrinks from the literal sense of Christ's words and says that the, quote, eunuchs, unquote, he refers to are those who, quote, upon some religious motive do abstain from marriage and the use of all carnal pleasures, that they may be less encumbered with the cares of the world and may devote themselves more closely to the service of God, unquote. Moonshine! Origen was a better judge than Cruden. If Jesus did not mean what he said, why did he take the trouble to speak? His doctrine is that of the anchorite. It led naturally to the filthy wretches called monks, who dreaded the sight of a woman and hoped to please God by stultifying nature. It also led to the church law forbidding women to touch the sacrament with their naked hands, lest they should pollute it. Only women who relish that infamous law can feel any respect for the teaching of Jesus. End of section 49. Reading by Tommy Hersant, Carlsbad, California.
Section 50 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Flowers of Freethought by George William Foote. Section 50. Poll on Women. Christianity, as the centuries have revealed its practical character, owes more to Paul than to Jesus. Its dogmas are mostly derived from the epistles of the great apostle. Many a true believer thinks he is obeying the carpenter's son, when all the time he is obeying the Tarsus tent maker. The Christian road to heaven was laid out and paved not by Jesus himself, but by the gentleman he, or a sunstroke, converted outside Damascus. Paul was in some respects a better teacher than Jesus. He was more practical, and with all his misty metaphysics, he had a firmer hold on the realities of life. But with respect to women, he follows dutifully in his Saviour's wake, and elaborates, rather than supplements, the sexual injunctions we have already dealt with. Like his master, he looks down upon marriage, and is evidently of opinion that if men should not make themselves eunuchs, they should live as such. The American Shakers are only carrying out his policy in this respect. If all the world imitated them, the human race would soon expire. It would then be impossible to adopt the children of outsiders. Families would be gradually extinguished, and the second coming of Christ would be prematurely hastened. Paul was a bachelor, and a crusty one. According to tradition or calumny, he was jilted by a Jewish woman, and this may account for his peevish attitude towards the sex. In the 7th chapter of the 1st of the Corinthians, he gives vent to a great deal of nasty nonsense. Quote, "It is good," he says, "for a man not to touch a woman." If he meant by this that men were not to trash their wives, we should have thoroughly agreed with him. But what he means is that there should be no sexual intercourse. He was especially severe on young widows who contemplated a second marriage. No doubt, if he had seen a young widow whose weeds, as is generally the case, were arranged coquettishly, he would have muttered, quote, "Anathema Maranatha." As his own constitution was liable to occasional weakness, he might have added, quote, "Get thee behind me, Satan." A few verses later, he expresses himself with greater clearness than Jesus Christ ever attained to. Quote, "I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn." Paul wished the same end as Jesus. He desired to see every person celibate. But having a little more common sense than Jesus, he saw that such preaching would never be extensively practiced, especially by young widows, and he was obliged to make a concession to human frailty. The very fact, however, shows that his view of the question was radically wrong. Marriage is not an excusable weakness, but the normal condition of mankind. Psychologically, mentally, and morally, this truth holds good. Even the highest virtues have never sprung from monasteries and convents, but for the rude, rough world of toiling and suffering men and women outside. According to Paul, although marriage was lawful, virginity was a higher state. That is, to be a perfect, a woman must stultify her nature and trample upon her maternal instincts. It also implies that she is essentially impure, and that she can only please God by abnegating her sex. This is the deepest disrespect of womanhood, as every healthy wife and mother would admit, if such stuff were taught by another than Paul. The great apostle troubled his poor head about the heads of women. If he lived now, when the ladies affect short hair, he would go raving mad. It was a subject on which he felt profoundly. To his mind, a woman losing her long hair was like an angel falling from glory. He warns the whole sex against meddling with their tresses. Men, however, are recommended to crop close, long hair being shameful. We have a shrewd suspicion that Paul was bald. Perhaps if hair restorer had then been invented, a successful trial might have considerably changed his views upon this subject. Man was not created for woman, says Paul, but woman for man. He is of course alluding to the old rib story, but a similar observation would have been as sensible about the two halves of a pair of scissors. When they meet, what does it matter which was made for the other? Consistently with this view he says, quote, "Wives, submit yourself unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord. As the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their husbands in everything." Some men have tried this with no great success, and many a man thinks he is having his own way, quote, "in everything," when he is sweetly and beautifully led by the nose. Obedience is a hateful word in marriage. Its introduction makes the wife a legalized concubine. Besides, if there must be obedience, Paul's rule is ridiculously sweeping, for some women have more sense and judgment than their husbands. Every afflicted woman who applies to the magistrate for relief from the sot who curses her home is flying in the face of Paul. Quote, "My dear woman," the magistrate should say, quote, "your request is very reasonable, but is very unorthodox. Go home and read the 5th chapter of the Ephesians, where you will see that wives must obey their husbands in everything." Paul warns women to keep silence in church, for, quote, "it is not permitted unto them to speak." Having written this line, Paul must have got up and strutted round the room like a ruffled cock. Quote, "Let the women," he says, "learn in silence with all subjection. I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the men, but to be in silence." Hear, hear, from the males in the body of the synagogue. Evidently, Paul could bray on occasion as lustily as Balaam's ass. If the women, quote, "will learn anything," which he clearly thought problematical, quote, "let them ask their husbands at home." Fancy some women with no other sources of information. The reason Paul gives for women's inferiority is that Mrs. Eve was first tempted by the serpent. And a capital thing too. If Mrs. Eve had not eaten that apple, the human race would still number 2, or else, if none of them died, they would be thicker than barreled herrings. Our Church of England marriage service follows the teaching of Paul. While the husband promises to love the wife promises to love, honor, and obey the husband. Many ladies say these words at the altar with a mental reservation. When they are obliged to do this, they tactfully admit that Paul and the Church are wrong. But if so, the Bible is wrong. The fact is that the, quote, "blessed book," instead of being women's best friend, is her worst enemy. The 10th commandment makes her domestic property, and Paul winds up by telling her that her sole duty is to play second fiddle in a minor key. End of chapter 50. Recording by AnaNaumoska.
Section 51 of Flowers of Freethought, First Series. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tommy Hersant, Carlsbad, California. Flowers of Freethought, First Series by G. W. Foote, Section 51, Mother's Religion. Religion is the feminine element in human nature. Science is the masculine. One accepts, the other inquires. One believes, the other proves. One loves the old, the other the new. One submits, the other dares. One is conservative, and the other progressive. I say this with no disrespect to women. Evolution has made them what they are, and evolution will remake them. Nor do I slight the noble band of advanced women, the vanguard of their sex, who have shed a luster on our century. I merely take a convenient metaphor which crystallizes a profound truth, though fully conscious of its shortcomings and exclusions. Woman is still the citadel of religion. Thither the priest flies from the attacks of skepticism. There he finds an inviolable refuge. The mother, the wife, the sister shield him and his creed, and their white arms and soft eyes are a better guard than all the weapons in the armory of his faith. His are the coward's tactics, but all creatures, even priests, plead the necessity of living, and have the artful instinct of self-preservation. Religious by inheritance and training, woman rears her children for the church. Spiritual as well as bodily perils shake her prophetic soul as she peers into the future through the eyes of the child upon her knee. She whispers of God with accents of awe that fall solemnly on the little one's mind. She trains the knee to bend, the hands to meet in prayer, and the eyes to look upward. She wields the mighty spell of love and peoples the air of life with phantoms. Infantile logic knows those dear lips cannot lie, and all is truth, for all is love. Alas, the lesson has to come, that the logic is faulty, that goodness may be leagued with lies, that a twisted brain may top the sweetest heart. But long ere the lesson is learnt, if it is learnt, the mischief has been wrought. The child has been molded for the priest, and is duly burnished with catechisms and stamped with dogmas. And how often, when the strong mind grows and bursts its bonds, when the mental eyes wax strong and see the falsehood, the mother's hand, through the child's training, plucks the life back from the fulfillment of its promise. How often also, when the vigorous manhood has swept aside all illusions, there comes at length the hour of lassitude, and as the mother's voice steals through the caverns of memory, the specters of faith are startled from their repose. Priests are always warning men against deserting the creed of their mothers, and even a savant like Professor Gazzia, who writes on Giordano Bruno, knows the trick of touching this facile chord of the human heart. Speaking of Bruno's philosophy, he says, quote, "I call it plainly the negation of God, of that God, I mean, of whom I first heard at my mother's knee," unquote. But free-thinking mothers, and happily there are such, will use their power more wisely, and above all, will not shrink from their duty. They have the fashioning of the young life, a transcendent privilege, with an awful responsibility. They will see that love nurtures the affections without suborning the intellect, that the young mind is encouraged to think instead of being stuffed with conclusions, and they will someday find their exceeding rich reward. Their children, trained in the school of self-respect and toleration, will be wiser than the pupils of faith, and the bonds of love will be all the tenderer and stronger for the perception that the free individuality of the child's life was never sacrificed to the parent's authority. End of section 51. Reading by Tommy Hersant, Carlsbad, California. End of Flowers of Freethought, first series by G. W. Foote.